Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen and today's video is another in our Themes in Literature series, and the theme we're going to look at today is vampires. So we're going to explore why vampires are so popular in literature. We're going to look at some examples of vampire literature, and we're going to talk about sentences that start with ing words. So why do we love vampires so much? Where does our obsession with them come from? Spooky, scary ghost stories are nothing new. They've been popular since storytelling began. But the word vampire made its way into the English language from Eastern Europe somewhere in the 18th century and became very popular in the 19th century. Polidori's short story, The Vampire, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, John Stagg's poem, The Vampire, and many other vampire stories all existed before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. However, Bram Stoker's Dracula is perhaps the quintessential vampire, and his book set the bar for an entire genre of literature to come, which then of course overflowed into other forms such as TV and film. Vampires are of course still hugely popular today, with Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, Stephen King's Salem's Lot, Stephenie Meyer's The Twilight series being just a few examples of vampires in modern literature. So why are vampire stories so popular? Perhaps their popularity stems from their potential to help us grapple with unanswerable questions. Telling stories about things that we don't understand helps us figure things out. Vampires fulfill a similar function to witches. They're the villains that we love to hate. They're a scapegoat for when things go wrong, and they embody our fear of the unknown. Some of life's difficult conundrums that run through vampire literature include life, death and immortality, good and evil, blood, the secret to eternal youth, sexuality, religion, race, disease, and many, many more. Let's have a little look at those more closely. Life, death and immortality. Vampires are neither dead nor alive. They're often described as the undead because they've found some kind of immortality in between life and death. And of course, death and immortality is something that occupies our thoughts a lot as human beings. We don't know what happens when we die. So we think about it a lot, and telling vampire stories is just one tool we have to help us figure these things out. Good and evil. Traditionally, vampires personify evil, whereas their victims are the embodiment of innocence and everything that is good. That's certainly true in traditional literature. It's certainly true in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but some of the more modern versions experiment with a slightly different angle on that. Blood. We cannot live without blood, but vampires greedily deprive their victims of it. Stories about vampires feature blood very prominently, and blood is a necessity of life. It's something that we can't live without. The secret to eternal youth. Human beings are constantly seeking ways to appear younger. There is a booming market for hair dye, makeup, cosmetic surgery, and all kinds of other things that help us to look younger. But vampires have found the solution to this problem. By drinking the blood of their victims, they become younger. Sexuality. This is represented in many forms in vampire literature. The image of the vampire sucking at the neck of their victims is like some kind of perverse sexual act. In Dracula, Dracula's victims are women. First of all, he targets Lucy, and then when Lucy dies, he transfers his attention to Mina. But Mina's husband is attacked by 3 vampire women, the 3 sisters that he encounters in Dracula's castle. In other literature, in, for example, John Stagg's poem The Vampire, both the victim and the vampire are male, which adds a different angle to the story. Religion, the theme of the afterlife and coming back from the dead, is key to most religions, but it's particularly prominent in Christianity. And the Bible, with its story of the resurrection and the story of Lazarus, for example. Also, in vampire stories, Christian symbols often serve as vampire deterrents, such as the crucifix and the consecrated host. Race. Dracula comes from a faraway land with a different language and different customs. And so he represents the foreign and the alien. He's not understood. And when Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania, he makes no attempt to understand the language and the customs, which perpetuates the alienness of everything to do with Dracula. Disease. Vampirism is passed on from the vampire to the victim, like an infectious disease, and it has the potential to spread to epidemic proportions, just like a terrible plague. Something which is even more relevant to us today after our experiences of the last few years with COVID. Dracula brings this disease with him on the ship. When the ship arrives in Whitby, its crew are found to be dead or missing, and the cause of that disease is now running free amongst the community. Today's extract is naturally taken from Bram Stoker's Dracula. I have 2 versions of Dracula. The Oxford World Classics version contains a lot of very useful notes at the end of the book explaining all the various references in the text. And this version is a recently produced one from the University of Derby, and at the beginning there are several essays from scholars at the university on different aspects of Dracula and vampire literature in general. The extract that we're going to look at is perhaps the climax of the story. The group of friends who have tasked themselves with the mission of ridding the earth of the scourge that is Dracula walk into the Harker's bedroom, where they find Jonathan Harker in some kind of semi-conscious stupor, and Mina, his wife, is being attacked by Dracula himself. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavily as though in a stupor. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw it, we all recognised the Count. In every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down onto his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a source of milk to compel it to drink. As we burst into the room, the Count turned his face, and the hellish look that I had heard described seemed to leap into it. His eyes flamed red with devilish passion. The great nostrils of the white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edges, and the white sharp teeth behind the full lips of the blood-dripping mouth champed together like those of a wild beast. With a wrench, which threw his victim back upon the bed as though hurled from a height, he turned and sprang at us. But by this time the professor had gained his feet and was holding towards him the envelope which contained the sacred wafer. The Count suddenly stopped, just as poor Lucy had done outside the tomb, and cowered back. Further and further back he cowered, as we, lifting our crucifixes, advanced. The moonlight suddenly failed, as a great black cloud sailed across the sky, and when the gaslight sprang up under Quincy's match, we saw nothing but a faint vapour. So how many of the themes that we mentioned earlier did you spot in this extract? There's certainly good and evil. The evil Count contrasts with the innocent Mina. There is certainly a lot of blood involved in the scene. Sexuality, the scene does have some very sexual overtones to it. As we step into the bedroom of the married couple and find this perverse act taking place. Religion, there are religious symbols in the extract. There is the sacred wafer and the crucifixes. And if we sat down for a very long time, we could probably identify many, many more themes in this extract. Another thing that features quite highly in this paragraph is colour. In fact, there are 3 colours that are mentioned several times. There is black, there is white, and there is red. Dracula is dressed in black, whereas Mina is dressed in white. Black symbolising the evil in Dracula and white symbolising the innocence of Mina. White is also used when describing the Count's face, his white aquiline nose and his white teeth, which are in stark contrast to how he's dressed in black, making his nose and his teeth stand out so that we notice them. White is also conjured up in the mention of milk, a cat drinking milk, a very innocent image, and in the moonlight. The moon gives light, and when there is light we can see what's happening, but at the very end of this passage black takes over, a black cloud comes across the moon. So suddenly there is no light and there is no ability to see. So light is knowledge, whereas dark and black is also ignorance and not knowing. And then there is the colour red. Obviously the colour red here is synonymous with blood. Both the Count and Mina are covered in it. Blood is life, but it's only life when it's inside us, and when it's inside us you can't see it. So when it's visible, that means that the life is draining away. So the colour red is a stark reminder that Mina's life is in the balance. Red is also used to describe the Count's eyes. His eyes flamed red with devilish passion. So the red is also associated with the devil and evil and all things demonic. And there is one other colour mentioned here, which is yellow in the first sentence. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. So yellow isn't quite as bright as white. If the light was white, it would be much easier to see. Everything would be much plainer. But the blind is filtering that light and making it yellow. So yes, they can see, but perhaps not as clearly as they might. So that is Bram Stoker's Dracula, the quintessential vampire in literature. I mentioned earlier a poem by John Stagg called The Vampire, which was written in the early 19th century, several decades before Dracula. And it tells a story of a man called Herman. Herman is married to Gertrude, and the poem takes the form of a conversation between Herman and Gertrude. There is another character in this story, though. It's a kind of love triangle, because the third character is Sigismund, who is Herman's friend. Sigismund and Herman have a rather strange relationship. Sigismund is dead, yet he visits Herman regularly in his bed at night. And Herman is aware of what Sigismund is doing. Sigismund is a vampire, and he visits Herman at night to drink his blood. And at the point where this story happens, Herman is dying because he has lost so much blood. And he is aware that when he dies, he will become a vampire like Sigismund, and he will prey on Gertrude. So in this poem he is warning Gertrude and telling her what is going to happen, and he makes her promise that the very moment he dies she must drive a stake through his heart to prevent that from happening. It's quite a long poem, so I'm not going to read it all in this video. However, if this story interests you, I've made a separate video of this poem which will be uploaded on the YouTube channel in a couple of days. And now for our language focus. Take a look at one sentence from the extract we've just looked at. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. And in particular, look at the first word, kneeling. Kneeling ends in ing, and it's a very common way of beginning a sentence with a word that begins with ing. In grammatical terms, it's known as a present participle, and it's a way of turning the sentence around to vary the word order. He could have said, the white-clad figure of his wife was kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards. It would mean the same thing, but instead, he's switched it round. He's put the second part of the sentence first. He could have done this with some other sentences in the passage. Instead of by her side stood a tall, thin man clad in black, he could have said, standing by her side was a tall, thin man clad in black. And instead of saying, with his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, he could have said, holding Mrs. Harker's hands with his left hand, he kept them away with her arms at full tension. But he doesn't. He only uses this technique once, because while it's a very useful and very common structure used in writing, it's also very easy to overdo. A lot of writers, myself included, often find upon rereading their work that they've used this a lot. So it's worthwhile going back through your work and seeing how many times have you used this, how many sentences have you begun with an ing word, and maybe changing one or two of them around. Beginning a sentence with the present participle is grammatically correct, but using it too much can make the writing sound repetitive and dull. As always, with most things in writing, variety is the key. So aim to use a selection of different sentence structures. Vary your language so you're not always using the same pattern, and that will help to keep the writing fresh and interesting. And now for our writing prompt. Of course, we have to have vampires in our writing prompt. Imagine you're walking near a graveyard at night and you encounter a vampire. Write that scene and tell that story in poetry or prose. And if you would like to share what you've written, feel free to put it in the comments. Just a brief reminder that the worksheets to accompany these lessons are available from our website at writtenwords.uk, as is my book, A Month of Writing Ideas, which contains a writing prompt for every day of a month. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, happy writing.